When did you first realize that doing the right thing was going to be the absolute hardest part of your leadership journey?
Rarely does a problem go away if you just ignore it. Being like a dandelion as a leader is one thing that I like to talk to people about. So dandelions, they're resilient and they can thrive in any conditions. You need to trust yourself to find those cracks in the sidewalk and find that fertile ground where you can take root as a leader and you can lead wherever you're at and make an impact. I think trust is the work. It's just like if the oxygen was pulled out of the room, now it's all anybody can think about, right? You can't breathe, you can't think, you can't make good decisions, you can't do your job without that. Once you see the cat on the woodpile, you can't unsee it. Mm-hmm. And how do you look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and tell yourself that you did right by students and by families and by your organization?
Alchemists, if you're listening and want to support the show right now, head over to our YouTube channel and subscribe. Growing the channel lets me bring on more incredible guests like the one we have today. Let's get back to our episode.
So, Corrine, before we get into the deep end today, I just have to say I'm really excited for this chat. Within your intake form, there was a statement you made that stood out to me a bit, and because I agree with it. And you wrote that what you need to do is right, not what's easy. When did you first realize that doing the right thing was going to be the absolute hardest part of your leadership journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's definitely, part of a moral compass that I've really always tried to operate under. And I think naturally, I just always kind of had a tendency towards that. But I think when I started to really articulate that as something that was going to really guide my leadership practice, it was probably when I became a vice principal and more so probably as a principal, where, somebody that I really respect once said to me that, at the end of the day, you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and know that what you did that day was doing right by students and by staff and by families in a school community. And so I share that because I think the two are really, really connected. And certainly in my role in schools and then later in the latter part of my career when I became part of two division office teams and notably in the area of HR, people services. Lots of times the scenarios and the situations that you're navigating through in that work sometimes is really, really complex and really difficult. But at the end of the day, what really matters is that students in schools have the best opportunities and have the opportunity to work with people that, are behaving in a manner that is good for the school division and good for students and their learning. And so lots of times that means that, we have to have hard conversations and we have to recognize maybe when something isn't sitting right with us and we need to step forward and we need to attend to it. If I could just share something else that's really stuck with me that I think kind of aligns with that is Patrick Lencioni talks about the concept of running to the fire. And sometimes we have that tendency of, we see something and what's easy is just to ignore it and hope it goes away, right? And that's a natural thing that all of us do as human beings and certainly as leaders that are juggling many, many other balls and many, many other priorities. But rarely does a problem go away if you just ignore it. And so when we move towards the fire, as soon as we see the smoke and we do the things that we need to do to attend to, putting out that fire or redirecting that fire, often we as leaders are better off for it. The people that are involved in that situation are, and certainly our organizations are too.
I appreciate you starting there. And for everyone tuning in, you're just getting introduced to Corrine Thorsteinson. She is an approachable and celebrated leadership professional with over 31 years experience in the education sector. Corrine recently retired as an associate superintendent from Red Deer Public Schools. She spent 11 years in people services portfolio before launching Agile Teams Leadership Consulting. She's a champion for finding joy in the work and the author of Pause, Reflect, Lead series. Corrine, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the Elemental Educator podcast today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited for the conversation.
And as somebody that listens to the show, you know we're going to take a journey through 4 elemental segments today. Let's jump into the first one on values. And so I will kick off Grounded Moments.
Okay.
3, 2, 1.
So here we look at what grounds you. And you mentioned your grounding quote is simply trust yourself. Talk to me about the journey to actually believing that.
Yeah. I think it seems so simple, but it's often one of the hardest things that we can do as leaders. And, there's been a number of experiences that I've had as a leader that have really helped me to understand just how vitally important that is. And I mean, if I could share one story, it would be, when I was working for one school division, and we had a period of time where there was quite a lot of upheaval and change in the leadership of the school division. And very quickly, I found myself in a new role as an acting associate superintendent. My predecessor found themselves in the role as an acting superintendent. And so, the ship of the school division continued to move, and everyone just needed to kind of pick up the pieces and continue to lead in the organization. And, there are many times during that period where I really did second guess, am I doing this right? Am I making the right decisions? And at some point, I just realized that I just had to trust myself and trust my intuition, and that most things, if you make a mistake, you can go back and you can correct it or you can fix it. So learning to really make the best decision you can with the information that you have was something that I was thrust into, but has become something that I think that was a really pivotal moment for me. And something that I realized is so important, for many other pieces that I have the privilege of really working with lots of leaders around the province and talking about, being courageous leaders and having opportunities where, to take another metaphor, being like a dandelion as a leader is one thing that I like to talk to people about. And that requires courage, and it requires a level of trust in yourself as well, because, dandelions, they're resilient and they can thrive in any conditions, and they basically grow wherever their seed is planted. And so if you adopt that kind of a mind frame as a leader, you do have to have courage and you do have to trust yourself. And so if you find yourself in a new environment or a new position or in conditions that maybe seem adversarial or maybe don't feel like on the surface they're where you can flourish, you need to trust yourself to find those cracks in the sidewalk and find that fertile ground where you can take root as a leader and you can lead wherever you're at and make an impact. So, I think those are just a couple of examples of how that statement has been really important to me.
With over 31 years experience in the field, not all of it in leadership, but have you seen a shift in how leaders involved in education perceive trusting themselves?
I think that I think probably good leaders always have developed that trust in themselves, but I do believe in the 31 years that I've spent in the education sector, I think the complexity for leaders has grown exponentially. I think that the dynamic of the amount of the mental load and the daily decisions that leaders in schools and in school divisions are making on a daily basis is pretty significant. And I would say significantly different than it was when I first started in a leadership role in a school. And so I think that leaders are thrust into situations where they need to trust themselves. But I do think that sometimes that can feel challenging. And often we have leaders who are finding themselves in those situations, and they maybe don't have the same amount of experience that leaders once did. Like, I think it was more common, back in my early days in education, where you wouldn't become a vice principal or an assistant principal until you maybe had, 12, 15 years of classroom teaching under your belt. And I think the trend now is really leaning towards people moving more quickly into those leadership roles, and, sort of having to make up for some of those gaps that 12 or 15 years of classroom teaching experience gives to you before you find yourself in a position where you're leading a staff and leading a school community. So I guess I think that, I think people are thrust into those positions. And I think it's something that I would like to see leaders really working towards, is building that confidence and that courage in their leadership. Because when you build those two pieces, that's when you can start to trust your intuition and start to lead from a place that's authentically who you are, rather than trying to be somebody that you're not.
And I think that I started to trust myself into the role, but it was the trust given to me by the people that oversaw me that made a significant impact. And, I think back to, when I was led by people that I feel didn't trust me, I always felt like I was walking on eggshells. And, right now, my current superintendent is phenomenal. She, I'm going to pump her tires a little bit here. She's gone out of her way to let me know how valued I am on the team, how valued everybody is on the team. She's the number one fan of, if you want to try something that's amazing, how are you going to do it? And she is the reason that I truly believe that most of our school leaders trust themselves to do their own jobs, because there's a level of modeled trust from above. And I don't know if I would be the leader I am today if it wasn't for her. So, sometimes I know she listens. So Michelle, if you're listening to this, from me to you, a thank you for trusting me to do what I do, because it lets me trust myself to be the best I can for my schools. And so with that, Corrine, I'm just wondering, we're talking about trusting ourselves, but what role do you feel the leader trusting others also has on that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I'm glad you pumped your superintendent's tires, because I think sometimes the accolades are too far and, few and far between. So I think that's great that you gave her credit for that. I absolutely have also been the benefactor of amazing people throughout my career. Like, as somebody who's, 5 months into retirement, I look back often and I just think about what a lottery I won. So many opportunities that I had to really rub shoulders and be connected with people who saw something in me and encouraged me and placed trust in me in some pretty big pieces in organizations that I worked for. And you're absolutely right. Like, when people demonstrate that they have trust in you, that builds confidence, and it builds courage to lead and to instill that in others. So I think that I think you're absolutely correct. It has a significant impact. And trust is I often compare it to like oxygen in a room, right? And so if I was to ask you to say one word that you think embodies somebody that you trust implicitly, like, what would that word be?
Oh man, probably warm.
Yeah. Yeah. So people say, often say things like that, like warmth or competence or confidence or reliability. There's all kinds of words that all of us would come up with. And we often don't think about those things. We just take that for granted when we have the privilege of working with people that we trust. But like oxygen in a room, if that's removed, like if you come to work on Monday
Yeah.
and that warmth is now not there, it's just like if the oxygen was pulled out of the room. Now it's all anybody can think about, right? You can't breathe, you can't think, you can't make good decisions, you can't do your job without that. And so it's like that. It's that invisible through line that sometimes we only notice when it's not there. And trust is, it's something that I think a lot about, and I talk to people a lot about. I think trust is the work. And I think that sometimes what can happen is that sometimes we misjudge the work that needs to take place in order to build that trust or repair that trust if it gets broken. And I've seen that happen, unfortunately, sometimes for leaders where they don't realize the effort and energy that needs to go into building that trust. And so they just assume sometimes that it comes implicitly with holding a title or sitting in an office or having a certain, duty or a certain role in an organization. And of course, there is some that does come with that. But if I can use another metaphor, I was just in Vancouver a couple of weeks ago, and being an Albertan, it's always a pleasure to go to the coast in the springtime because they're, 4 to 6 weeks ahead of us. And so everything was in beautiful bloom there. And so I was looking at all these beautiful trees that were in bloom, and it just really made me think about this metaphor of like, you see those blooms and what you're seeing is the end result. But what you didn't see is all the work that happened over the winter for that tree to be healthy enough to produce those blooms. And so, it's similar when it comes to trust. And I could go on and on about trust, but I'll just share one other thing that has really been helpful to me in terms of trying to pay it forward, I guess, being so grateful for the people that have placed their trust in me in various places where I've had the privilege to work. And how do I want to pay that forward? And so a model of trust that I've really embraced over the last many, many years is through the work of an author named Charles Feltman. And he wrote this book called The Thin Book of Trust. And he breaks down trust into 4 distinct kind of dimensions. And so those are care, reliability, sincerity, and competence. And so, every one of us would probably put one of those 4 things a little bit higher in terms of how we make a judgment as to whether we're going to trust somebody or not. And so when you are operating from a place of trust as a leader, I think it's really important to be aware of all 4 of those and aware of the fact that, if I really value being caring, that's how I'm going to operate. And that's a great thing. But if you really value reliability over being caring as a leader, and I do things, even though I care about our school and you as a staff member and that kind of thing, if I don't demonstrate to you that my word is my bond, and if I say I'm going to do something, I'm actually going to follow through on that, that may get in the way of your ability to form trust. And likewise, if I breach that trust in that area of reliability with you, and then I try to repair that trust from a place of like, oh, gee, Tyler, like, I hope I really care about you. That's all great. But for you, the important part was I didn't follow through on what I said I was going to do. So, I think there's some great work out there around trust. And I think sometimes we want to shy away from talking about trust. Nobody wants to kind of wade into the deep end and talk about the fact that maybe trust is a function of something that isn't going the way that we want it to.
I totally agree with you. Corrine, we are jumping into a game here called Principle or Preference. I will throw a statement your way, and you just tell me if it's a firm principle you stand by or a flexible preference, depending on the situation. Okay? So, principle or preference, here's your first one. Trust is established through competence rather than care.
Preference.
There we go. Reflective practice requires a scheduled block of time.
Principle.
Leadership requires a formal title to be effective?
Preference.
A leader must protect their team from all organizational adversity.
Preference.
You should wait for the right conditions before stepping up to lead.
Preference.
A good leader always has the final say on human resources procedures.
Preference.
Vulnerability is a requirement for building trust.
Principle.
The best way to build capacity is through formal mentorship programs.
Preference.
No, I agree with you actually, and I'll pause the game for a sec because I think the informal mentorship programs are so much stronger. And I'm just wondering, from your experience in human resources, what have you seen work best for the development of future leaders?
Yeah. I mean, I believe strongly in formal mentorship programs. I've been involved with them for years and years and years, and really do, like, I would never want to discredit the value that those programs hold. But I also know that not everybody can or does participate in those programs, right? And so that leads to that question of, well, how are we building that capacity in the people who, for good reasons, sometimes are unable to participate, or, in bigger organizations, sometimes you have to get into application processes and things like that for formal mentorship programs, and you don't simply have enough seats for everybody, right? But that doesn't mean that people aren't on a leadership trajectory or aren't wanting to learn. I think that I think building capacity is a lot like building trust. It's built in the small moments. It's built in our day-to-day interactions, how we interact with people, on the little things, because the little things are often the big things. And I think that as leaders, people are watching how we lead. And one of the biggest things that we can do to build capacity in others is be great leaders and model the way for how leaders operate when things are good, but most importantly, when things are hard.
That's right.
That is the sign of a true leader, is how you navigate yourself and how you navigate the people that you are entrusted with through difficult times. And so when we can demonstrate that, and we can show that, people who are hungry for advancing themselves as leaders, whether that's formally or informally, they're watching and they're learning from that.
Yeah, it's a good response to that. Consistency is more important than context when applying policy.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Why is it tough?
I'm going to say I would say that consistency is absolutely important. And that is a big reason why you have admin procedures and policies and things like that. Yeah. But I don't think you can ignore context, because I have learned over the years, every situation has its own nuance and its own set of circumstances. And so I think you need to look at the full picture. And you need to decide with your procedures or your policies, what are the really rock pieces of that? Like, what are the things that you can't go against, or the hills that you will die on, and find a way sometimes to navigate contextually as a result of that.
So I'm hearing preference.
Preference, yes.
Yeah.
That's a tough one for me, but I will say preference. Yeah.
People will naturally follow you if you have a good track record.
Preference.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that good track records always mean people follow you too.
No, so, I think good track record helps. And especially for people who place a lot of clout on competence.
Yeah.
But if you have a great track record, but you've demonstrated to somebody or somebody's that you're not reliable, or you don't care, or that you're not sincere, your track record might not be enough.
Yeah. Well, I put you through some adversity there. So that's a good way to segue from our earth element and talking about, the ground we stand on here to our air segment. And so let's get into headwinds and tailwinds.
Okay.
So So you did make a massive career jump in yourself from leaving one division after 27 years. And you had a deep, I would say, social capital there. Then you walked into another school division with no history, no tailwinds. Take me through that first month. And how did you navigate the headwind?
Yeah. Um, it was the most, I would say that was probably the most courageous thing I ever did in my career was leave an organization after, 30, almost 30 years of tailwinds. And tailwinds are great because they give you great momentum, right? Like you can really get stuff done when you have that behind you. And so, yeah, I was embraced by a new school division after 27 years in my previous division. And yeah, I didn't have the social capital coming in there. People didn't know me. I didn't have that shared history. People hadn't been seeing me work for 27 years. And so, to go back to my dandelion metaphor, like I had to find the cracks in the sidewalk, and I had to find where I could take root quickly and where I could start to flourish. And I had to rely on my internal compass and my internal competence. I had to trust myself that I had years in this work. I knew the work. It just, I was doing the work in a different environment and with different people. And so I would say that, some of the headwinds that I had to be really intentional about were trying to earn trust through that noticeable work. And so when I say that, because I couldn't rely on history or a reputation that preceded me, I had to be really intentionally present whenever I was interacting with people. I had to do a lot of listening and ask a lot of questions and understand things for why they were the way that they were. Because, sometimes you would think that two school divisions who share a border, right? Like they're right next door to each other. You would think that that they would be totally the same, and that's just simply not the case from any organization. And so when you go somewhere new, you have to have a healthy respect for the way that things are done there, and you have to trust that there's a reason why things are done the way that they are, even if you don't initially understand them.
Yeah.
And so, I think for me, I needed to embrace that stretch, and I needed to embrace that, I was a little bit like, somebody who had kind of landed somewhere, and I spoke like 75% of the language, and I understood 75% of the things around me. And so my job was to really, kind of embrace those four dimensions, and how could I show people that I was competent? How could I show people that even though I was getting to know them in this organization, I cared about this organization and I cared about the people there, that I was reliable, that if I said I was going to do something, that I would follow through on that. And that I was sincere, that when I say something, that's actually what I mean. And there's nothing, nothing behind that or no ulterior motive. And so, really digging in and embracing those things, I think, did help me. And I feel confident that in a very short period of time, I was able to establish myself and I guess lean into those headwinds. And, I think have some of those maybe turn and become tailwinds for me.
Yeah. And I'm going to play off of your dandelion metaphor here. So where was the first crack you found at your new division to let your dandelion grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my very early first few days there, it was really interesting because I had a number of staff members that just knew I'd started and decided they wanted to come and check me out and have a chat and talk to me about things. And
they wanted to see if the warmth was there, right? For that.
That's
trust.
right. I think so. Like they wanted to sort of put a human behind this name and this person that was coming from somewhere else. And then I feel like once they established in that initial interaction that there was a warmth there and that I was leaning in and trying to understand, people shared with me some things about some experiences that they had had. And they shared with me, they were vulnerable enough to kind of share how that had landed with them or how they felt about those things. And so over and above, I heard a multitude of things, but I would say one through line that I heard was people sharing with me their experiences with certain procedures or processes. And so because I started to recognize that through line fairly quickly, like within the first 3 or 4 days on the job, having, 7, 8, 9 people come in and kind of share things that were
What they want to see
related.
changed. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I was kind of like, okay, I think here's an opportunity where I can hear this.
Mhm.
And it's not to take away how things were done before I arrived there, but it was me coming and recognizing that maybe there's a need and maybe there's a role I can play right out of the gate here.
Yeah.
And I can address some of these things, and maybe I can come up with some solutions that put people in a situation where maybe that isn't their experience. And so I would say those were some of the first cracks that I found, and some of those first seeds that I planted. And I would say what I heard fairly quickly in the organization is that those seeds were well received, and we started to flourish as a result of some of those changes that we made early on.
Mhm.
And people started to recognize that I listened, and that I was sincere when I said I was hearing them, and that I did follow through, and that I did bring a level of skill and experience to those situations to maybe look at how we could approach those things in a different way.
Yeah. And we talked about earlier, a fundamental piece of building trust is having that follow through. I talk about a bit with trust. You need to deliver some quick wins. And
Yes.
sounds like you were able to deliver quick wins, and that's
Yeah.
what led to that successful place. But Corrine, it's time to put you in the hot seat. So
Okay.
you're going to have 30 seconds to give me your first move, your dandelion moves here, of
Okay.
each of these leadership scenarios. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So scenario 1 is a veteran staff member makes a significant public error in judgment.
Yeah. First move is understand what happened, and ask a lot of questions to find out what happened, what were the circumstances, and how do we move forward.
Scenario 2 is your staff survey reveals a sudden drop in trust toward the administration team.
Yeah. Uh, Pause, get over the sting of that, and then start to unpack that and understand why. And, if I was supporting an administrator that was in that situation, I would very much want us to unpack it through those 4 dimensions of trust.
Mhm. Scenario 3 is an aspiring leader on your team is getting impatient about not receiving a promotion.
Mm, yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah.
I would say, and I've had this conversation with lots of people, um, keep leading where you're at and keep being great at what you're doing. Um, and the right thing will come along if you continue to do that. I think sometimes it's a dangerous game where people push too hard to land something that isn't actually the right time or the right opportunity for them. And, sometimes that doesn't work out as well as we would hope that it would. And so, uh, something that I say to people all the time, just keep leading what you're doing and where you're at, and the rest will fall into place.
Little Dory reference there, right? Instead of just keep swimming,
Yeah,
just
that's
keep leading.
right.
I like it. That's good. That needs to become a poster up in my wall at some point. Okay, a principal is overwhelmed and refusing to delegate responsibilities.
Yeah. Start with why. What are the obstacles? What are the challenges? Is that a leadership blind spot? Is that as a function of an experience that they've had that, has maybe caused them to feel more hesitant or worried about doing that? And talking about those things, I think sometimes provides that clarity and helps us reveal how do we take those steps in a way that feels good, and helping people see the missed opportunities that if you don't delegate and you need to be the eye of the needle on everything all the time, you're not building capacity in the people that you
Yeah.
work with. And none of us are perfect as leaders, and so none of us have all the answers. And when we extend that leadership circle to other people, our schools or our organizations are better for it, because
Mhm.
lots of brains thinking about something is generally more effective than just one.
Yeah. And scenario 5 here, you realize a new policy you implemented is actively harming school culture.
Yeah, you need to stop and you need to understand how it's harming, and you need to be open and receptive to the fact that maybe you need to make some adjustments or some changes. I think sometimes we work hard on those kinds of processes and procedures, and we get them locked down, and then it's hard sometimes to go back and open them back up and make changes. But I think as a leader, you need to be agile and flexible, and you need to be responsive to what you're hearing in terms of people's experiences.
Mhm. And the hardest question out of the hot seat here is, that was 5 scenarios. How many of those scenarios have you actually dealt with?
Absolutely every one of them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's wild.
And yeah. And, I'm not afraid to say some of those I've dealt with as the leader,
Mhm.
and, from my own experience, and certainly in my time, notably in people services, had the opportunity to help others navigate through all of those pieces.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. We are going to jump into the second game here on the Headwinds and Tailwinds segment called Flip the Script.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you a negative or provocative statement, and you either accept it as true, or you're going to help me flip this into a better truth for us.
Okay.
Okay, so the first statement is, you have to wait for the perfect conditions before you can be successful.
There are no perfect conditions, and so you need to lead where you're at, and you need to lead in the conditions that you're at, and you need to find the cracks where you can grow and flourish.
Trust is something you inherently have, meaning you either are trustworthy or you're not.
I think that you can develop trust, you can grow trust, and you can repair trust. I think being trustworthy is like having a well-built bridge across a river. But developing trust and nurturing trust is inviting people to walk across that bridge. So being trustworthy is important, and there's probably an inherent part of people that reflects. But we can be trustworthy and still break trust with people.
Mm-hmm. A leader's primary job is to avoid difficult conversations to keep peace.
A leader's job is to run towards the difficult conversations, because ultimately, you won't have peace unless you address things that need to be addressed, and unless you have hard conversations, whether that's about performance, or whether that's about teaching and learning, or accountability, or any host of subjects.
Reflective practice is another task on an overwhelmed administrator's plate.
Reflective practice is the work. It's part of the work, and I don't know that you can truly lead if you don't find some kind of mechanism that works for you to stop and notice what matters, and notice what impact you're having with the work that you're doing.
And we kind of talked about the last one here. If staff do not trust you, it means you're not trustworthy.
Yeah, I do think there's a distinction. I think you can be trustworthy, but I think staff all have the lens that they look through and the things that are important to them. And I think that sometimes that's why that stings when people will get feedback. In particular, this can happen on like appraisal processes and things like that for school administrators, where maybe the results on those surveys or those processes aren't what a leader had expected. And it can sting, because you believe you are a trustworthy person, and you probably are. But those small moments sometimes create a picture of who you are as a leader, and depending on what lens people are looking through, that might be more impactful than sometimes we give it credit for.
I'm just trying to think here, like the definition between trust and trustworthy. Like I have heard people say before, I don't trust you, but I know you're going to get it done. Not to me, but to somebody else in that statement.
Yeah.
And it might be the way they talk. It might be the way that they even dressed, and there's a judgment placed on that person on what, or that warm feeling that we've talked about. I don't trust you, but you've never let me down type of scenario. Right.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I think I would rather be trustworthy, where to me that word means I have the follow through, versus being trusted, which is the feeling that somebody has towards somebody, right?
I think I don't disagree with what you're saying at all, Tyler. But I do think, like, when you give that example, like, and this comes up, like, I would say that, if you're looking at those 4 dimensions of trust, I would say that care, if any of those carries more weight, it would definitely be care, right? When people think that you care about them, they will typically give you the benefit of the doubt if you have a misstep in the other 3 dimensions.
Oh, for sure.
So you know
For
what I
sure.
mean?
For sure.
And so sometimes, school leaders in particular can get that feedback. It's like, I know you care about the school and I know you care about the staff, but you're constantly dropping the ball and you don't ever follow through on what you say you're going to say. Or, I'm never sure if what you're telling me is actually the truth. And so I think the care piece that you're talking about, I would say definitely taps into being trustworthy. I don't think you can be a trustworthy person if you don't care. And I don't think people will see you as a trustworthy person if they don't perceive that you care.
Yeah.
But I feel like those other 3, sometimes that's maybe where that nuance lies. But sometimes people don't recognize us as trustworthy if they're looking really hard through some of those other lenses.
Yeah. And, we talked a little bit about how trust can lead to buy-in, to lead to change. So let's jump into that water element and ripples of change.
Okay.
Okay, so we already agreed that you think aspiring leader programs are horrible.
I did not say that.
That's right. But what I want to know is, you did spearhead one in your most recent position, and you opened it to everyone, including caretakers and division office staff. What inspired that specific change instead of just keeping it for teachers and admin?
Yeah. So I think it really came from a desire that we had as an organization to kind of make a shift from leadership as a formal title to building a leadership culture. And, like that's a simple, but it's kind of a radical premise, right? Because in most school divisions, for good reason, we spend a lot of time nurturing and developing leadership in our certified staff. And that's a very important thing that we need to do.
Staff meaning teachers, right?
That's right. Yeah. But we also have many people in our organization who make leadership decisions, who hold formal leadership roles, who don't have a lot, like the trajectory of their career wasn't such that they, belong to a professional association and have opportunities to nurture that. Yet they're leading in our school divisions. And so, it was really grounded in that idea that leadership is for everyone. There's no secret handshake here. There's no secret to being somebody in an organization who can act like a leader. And so, we had lots of other programs that we used to develop our teaching staff towards leadership, towards building capacity in classrooms and that kind of thing. And those are great programs and have a really significant impact. But for us, aspiring leaders became something that we opened up. And so we held sessions roughly about every other month. And those sessions started at 4:15 in the afternoon. So if you can imagine, we were drawing from lots of members of our teaching staff, school administration, division office staff, people from our facilities and maintenance, caretakers, social workers, school secretaries, you name it. People were coming out, and they were coming at the end of their workday. and they were coming to take part in these sessions. And, you know, I often
I just have to say, I think you, in your intake, you said up to 70 people were coming to these, which is incredible.
It is unbelievable. And I would say frequently to Chad, the superintendent, oh my gosh, like I every time that we have these sessions, I wonder if this is going to be the one where people stop coming. But they kept coming, right?
And or they come with pitchforks.
40 to 70 people showing up at 4:15 until 5:30. Yeah. And it's because they wanted to have opportunities to learn about leadership, to talk about leadership with other people that were interested in being leaders, and they wanted to build their own capacity. And so, you know, the value of that was not in the content that I was delivering. It was in the rich conversations and opportunities that people had to talk about those things and share their perspectives and hear what that was like from people that maybe do something different than they do in the organization. And so I think that when I think about the what was the impact of that, or what was the legacy that left behind? One, I think accessibility, like we demystified what leadership is all about. And we made leadership really accessible, and we created a culture where whatever your role is in the organization, you too can be a leader in our school division. Recruitment, retention, like we really started to build some robust capacity. And I think that comes in those informal moments like that, where people start to see themselves as leaders and believe in themselves as leaders. And as a result, then they stop waiting for other people with formal titles to always solve the problems. They start to take ownership, and they start to see areas where they can have an impact, or where they can build that capacity. And, you know, that, and as a result, like that organizational mindset, that culture of leadership is very much what I think we created, and I know has continued on after I've been gone from the organization, and it continues to be something that that people look forward to, and that people see as a really vital step in their leadership journey, wherever that journey is taking them. And for some people, that's a formal position, and for other people, that's being great backbones in the organization and making great decisions and understanding things from the perspective of being a leader in the organization. And that just makes a school division stronger. So that was a real privilege to be involved in that, and to have an opportunity to work with people in that capacity.
And it's sad to think about how, when we think of non-teaching staff, it's thank you for your hard work. Thank you for your dedication. Thank you for your passion. But it's not thank you for your leadership. Right. And that's a narrative that needs to change. You know, I'm a believer in leader in me. So my only question back to you is, why were parents and students not included in this group as well?
That's an excellent question. And I would say that would be a phenomenal next iteration of that aspiring leaders type of program, an opportunity absolutely for parents to come and understand through that lens of leadership what the school division is trying to achieve and the culture that we're creating, and having an opportunity to interact, and for students to have input and you know, learn those skills as well, because ultimately we need everybody in the organization to operate from that lens. And that's what makes an organization stronger and more successful for students, which is, as we know, ultimately the number one priority.
And you shared with me right before we pressed record that you just finished listening to the Jimmy Cassis episode. And one of the segments we talked about with Jimmy was the carrying the banner. And when you run this aspiring leaders program and you've opened the door to these people, you actually have now very intentionally created all these modalities where people are now carrying your banner for you in all these different levels, because they feel valued, important, and that they're a part of the leadership team. So I honestly, I don't really think we need to continue with the water segment here, because this whole point of change is, this is how you get a grassroots bottom up system, is you invite them to be a part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to use that to actually just jump right into the decision making here. So let's get into our final element of spark or burn.
Alchemists, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify and you're enjoying this episode, it would mean everything to me if you head over to that platform quickly and give us a rating or a review. Giving those ratings and reviews help us reach more of an audience for the show. And that is the entire goal of what we're trying to do, impact. Thank you so much.
Corrine, we're going to play final answer. So I'm going to give you 2 words and you just pick one to move on. We're going to go champion versus champion for 10 rounds and see what survives.
Okay.
Okay. Reliability or sincerity?
Sincerity.
And I'm going to try to get you here. So sincerity, sincerity or care?
Tyler, you're killing me here.
Let's go.
Care.
Care or competence?
Did you say confidence or competence?
Competence.
Care.
Does it change if it was confidence?
Probably not. No.
Okay.
They're so close. Like, I'm splitting hairs, but
yeah, I know where you're going on this one, but I'll say it anyway. Care or title?
Care.
Care or action?
Care.
We'll come back to that one. Care or reflection?
Care.
Care or resilience?
Care.
Care or process?
Care.
Care or dignity?
Care.
I got to get you to flip here. Care or trust?
Trust.
Hey, there we go. And I did that on purpose. That wasn't my actual one I was going to give you, but I was like, we've been on care for a while. I got to get her to flip. What I actually want to know is that hesitation that you gave between care and action. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Well, again, like I just feel like I was splitting hairs on that one. And I think the reason I stuck with care is action's important. Like, care on its own doesn't move an organization forward. Like, you can be the most caring organization in the world, but you do have to have actions. However, I think that action without care is maybe sometimes transactional and not as impactful as it could be. So that's why I went towards care, but that was a tough one for me.
What's the most important thing that we haven't talked about today?
Yeah, I think that I would say that doing what's right and not what's easy is, we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, and in that idea of, looking yourself in the mirror and that kind of thing. I think that when I think about the things that I believe are really vital in leadership, developing trust, being courageous, making good decisions, all of those kinds of things, a lot of times it comes from that place of doing what's right and not what's easy. And we're all wired to run from the fire. But, and that's not that you go looking for problems and you don't go looking for conflict and things like that. But I would be hard pressed to believe anybody that could convince me that when you see something and it doesn't sit well, not dealing with it rarely ever makes it better. And, I'll just use another analogy. Like, you've maybe seen, shows up in presentations all the time, where somebody shows you this picture and it's of a woodpile, and it's kind of like orange and yellow type tones in the photograph. And you're supposed to sit and look at that picture and list all the things that you see. And, so people do that and they listed all the different wood and all the different things that they see. And then the next slide that the presenter will show you is that same wood pile. And there's an orange cat sitting on the top of the wood pile and the cat's circled, right? And most people, myself included, the first time I did it, I didn't see the cat. I didn't see it. And then they show you the slide again without the cat circled, and now you can't not see the cat, right? And so I think that leadership, like, and that idea of doing what's right and not what's easy is a lot like that. Like, once you see the cat on the woodpile, you can't unsee it. And how do you look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and tell yourself that you did right by students and by families and by your organization if you don't have the courage to do the things that you know you need to do in order to make sure that every kid in your school, every kid in your organization, every staff member that works for you has the best opportunities for teaching and learning and leading in your organization. So I think that's a big thing, and that's hard, and it takes courage, and it's not fun sometimes, and it's really not easy sometimes. But ultimately, when you're trying to honor the organization that has entrusted you in whatever role you're playing, I think it's a pretty vital thing that you need to consider as a leader.
Corrine, retired as of recently, but also not retired, because what are you doing now?
Yeah. So I've been saying to people, I'm not sure how I had time to go to work. I've been busy doing a lot of really great stuff. And so, one thing that I started after retirement, so I retired at the end of December 2025. I started a leadership consulting company called Agiliteams Leadership Consulting. And so I have had lots of great opportunities to work with, different schools and school divisions around Alberta, specifically around leadership. I also, we've had a chance to talk throughout this interview about how much I value reflective practice and how vital I think that is to really being an effective leader. And one of the things that we touched on is that the complexity of leadership, in particular in schools and school divisions, has just skyrocketed, right? And so I feel like, and I felt like this as a leader too sometimes, that there's so many things that you're doing every day that you kind of in autopilot, and you never have the opportunity to step back and think about what really matters on the day-to-day basis, and think about why you're working so hard and what the impact of that work actually is. And think about how you could look at problems in a different way, because you're just go, go, go. And so I really have thought a lot about that and wished over the course of my career that I had some kind of a mechanism in a really manageable way to just take a few minutes and pause and reflect. And so something else that I've kind of dug into in retirement is I've published three different daily reflection guides. So one called Pause, Reflect, Lead, which is for school leaders. One's called Pause, Reflect, Teach, which is for classroom teachers. And the other one is called Pause, Reflect, Lead Systems. And those are really modeled around a question a day journal. And you might be familiar with those, where you revisit the same topic for a course of a few years. And as a result, you can kind of see what stays the same and maybe what evolves or changes in your practice. And so I wanted to create those because I know that even just taking 5 minutes a day and cracking that book open and taking 5 minutes a day to think about the prompt, lots of times it's serendipitous that the prompt is maybe exactly what you needed to think about on that particular day. And sometimes maybe it's not, but it's just good because maybe you've been so busy thinking about other things that you haven't had a chance to consider that. So that's been another fun project that I've had the opportunity to do and to get that into people's hands. And I've had lots of really great feedback from people on the value of that as a process for them. I've had lots of opportunities to meet great educators all over the province through some work at various teachers conventions around Alberta early this year, and doing some work with the Alberta Professional Learning Consortium in various communities, as well as with CAS, with Start Right for Leaders and Leading for Learning as well. So yeah, I'm getting to do all kinds of things that just really give me a lot of joy, and meeting a lot of great people as a result of it.
And if you're listening, wondering how to get in touch with Agility teams or any of these reflective books, just check the description of this episode. It's all going to be linked there for you. Corrine, my previous guest leaves a question for the next guest, not knowing who they are, what they bring, or what we're talking about. And the question left for you was, who was it in your life that spoke into your life and gave you the confidence to help you become the person that you are today? And you're not allowed to just go with the trust yourself part.
Yeah, no, for sure. Oh, I just have had so many people that have played that role for me. Absolutely. It's hard to pick one, but I will. And I'm going to say that somebody in particular who did that for me very early in my career was the first principal that I worked with as a vice principal. And I was quite early in my teaching career when I became a vice principal. I was 5 years as a classroom teacher, and I've always appreciated and had a high level of gratitude for her seeing something in me at that stage in my career and trusting me with a very important role in the school, and nurturing and growing me and seeing the potential in me. And I know that had she not encouraged me, and had she not taken a chance on somebody with pretty small amount of experience to enter into that role, I know that none of the other amazing things that my career brought me over 31 years, I don't think any one of those would have ever happened had she not been sort of that catalyst and spoken that truth of, be confident, you have skill, you have something to offer, you can do this job. You can go, you can do this. And so I've always been so grateful for that opportunity. And then there, like I said at the beginning, I just feel like I hit the jackpot with everywhere that I had the opportunity to work, and just had a great opportunity to work with so many influential people, and people who believed in me and trusted in me. And I hope in some small way over the course of my career that I've been able to offer that same support and encouragement for others.
Yeah. There's a bit of a theme here, because they asked me this question as well, and my response was my first principal too. So I think there has to be some correlation between that impact the first principal has on people. But what I would like to know is, what question would you like to leave my next guest?
Yeah. I think that the question that I would like to ask is probably, kind of around that idea of like capacity. And so I would say, if the person who's answering this question, if they were to strip away their formal title and the authority that comes with whatever their role is, and they were to think about, kind of the core seed of leadership that they think that they've planted in others, what would that seed be that they believe will endure long after they move on from wherever they're working or the organization that they're at? And I think the second part of that is, how would they know that?
It's a great question, and I'll make sure it gets to them. Corrine, I really appreciate the honesty, the depth, everything that you brought to this conversation. Your perspective from leading from wherever you are is something so many people needed to hear. So thank you so much for just giving me your time and joining me on the show today.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been a real honor and a privilege to be here. And just to have this conversation, I think, is super important, because, I would say that sometimes maybe that's another blind spot for leaders. And a lot of that comes from the busyness and the complexity that comes with leadership these days, is I don't know if leaders spend enough time talking about leadership with other leaders. And so anytime that you have that opportunity to dig in like this is a real treat and a real privilege. So thank you for having me and allowing me to be part of what you've created here. I think you've got great momentum, and you're really creating an incredible space for people to think about what's important.
Thanks for sticking around to the end of the show. If you have feedback, a suggestion, or just want to start a conversation, fire off an email to tyler@elementaleducator.com. I actually read them. And if this episode sparks something, leave a review on Apple or Spotify. It helps more leaders find the show. And don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, where I put out additional content. I'll see you next time, same same place.